It's a thing these days to talk about how Mormons feel falsely persecuted for this, that, and the other thing. It's hard for me to believe that Mormons for that feeling when you read novels like this, when you're constantly being talked about in these terms, and when you go back east for business or on a tour of Europe, this is, as soon as anybody finds out you're from Utah, this is what they have in their minds.
We're bringing you a live panel discussion for Dime Novel Mormons that was held at the Greg Kofford Books office. Dime Novel Mormons was released on March 21st and is the latest volume in the Mormon Image literature series, edited by Michael Austin and Ardis Parshall. First off, a couple of items to mention. Mike Austin joined us via Google Hangouts, so sometimes his audio gets a little distorted or there's feedback loops. Also, due to my own error, the recording begins at about a minute into Mike giving us an overview on the Mormon Image and Literature series. You can learn more about Dime Novel Mormons and the Mormon Image and Literature series, including previews of the titles, reviews, and author Q&As at gregkofford.com.
Form that I could find when I sat down to try to write something about that period of Mormonism and literature. And I mentioned this to Ardis, who takes that sort of statement as a challenge. And within a couple of days, she had found, I think, the only copy of that book in all of the world in the church archives. I mean, it was by the Alton, Illinois Courier Press. So it was basically just a local, very limited run, but it is the first novel in American literature to feature Mormon characters. So Ardis had found it. She had transcribed it. I all of a sudden had this book that I'd been trying to find for maybe 10 years. And I thought, books like this that are really hard to get a hold of, even in the internet era, even in the age of libraries digitizing collections, there are a lot of books that are hard to find that were important in the development of the Mormon image in the American mind. And Ardis happens to be about the best living archival researcher I've ever met. And she had a lot of these books. And so I pitched the series to Kofford. I said, these are books that researchers need that aren't available. People have been making really dumb statements about these books. The Mormonness, for example, was routinely described for 30 years as an anti-Mormon book. It's nothing of the sort. We just set out to try to find books that are very difficult to find, to provide a critical apparatus, to situate them, to provide historical context that has never been part of the discussion of these books before, and to have a lot of fun, because these are fun books.
Can we talk real briefly just kind of about the history of the dime novels themselves and what preceded that? Various names of Penny Dreadfuls, for instance. Can you just give us a bit of a historical background on this movement in literature?
Me or Ard? Do you want to field that, Ardis, or do you want me to do it?
He's looking at you.
Okay.
Unless you would like to, Ardis.
No, I'll add some comments. But
the amazing and unique thing in American literature, the Penny Dreadfuls were the British variant. So the Penny Dreadfuls were the British versions of the dime novels. There were some dime novel-y things in the 1850s. They tend to be small print runs. They didn't have huge firms behind them. Boudica, the Mormon wife, was kind of an early dime novel-y thing. Has the same marketing approach as the dime novel, but at a much smaller scale. So in 1860, Beadle and Adams, small printing house, writes to a 20-year-old serial called Maleska, the Indian Wife, and reprinted that. Sold for about $1, $1.25. That was what it cost to buy a novel. They put this on newsprint. They did away with all of the extras. There weren't covers. There weren't binding. There was just minuscule, tiny font, and they managed to get this down to 10 cents. And it sold 500,000 copies. It had been written 20 years ago, because there was a newly literate audience, and they were not book owners. You had a large number of readers who were not book owners in the United States, because books were still prohibitively expensive. I mean, $1.25, $1.50, that's like $50 for a book if you look at it in modern terms, if you just adjust for inflation. So Beadle and Adams just pumped these out for the next almost 35 years. They pumped out dozens of series, dime novels, and really owned the market from about 1860 to 1890, and then 4 or 5 other firms, Frank Tousi, Street and Smith, got into the game and started publishing more detective things novels. The original dime novels all tended to be westerns.
Ardis, do you want to add to that?
I'll go back to the first question. The Mormon Image in Literature, that book, The Mormoness, that is in the church archives, comes from a library in a public school in South Africa. That's how widely some of these things were circulated. And yet they're unknown today.
That up in the archives.
The church makes a concerted effort to collect everything that is by or for or about Mormons, and I have no idea whether someone donated it or somebody saw it in a catalog and realized that it belonged to the library. I don't know. But it's come that far in order to be preserved. So these things really are hard to find.
And what about your other sources for the Dime Novel Mormons? Are they in the archives as well?
Some of them that are in the series are in the archives. Others Mike has found by making best friends with interlibrary loan librarians all over the country.
In the Dime Novel Mormon only exist in one copy, and I had to convince the library to basically destroy the dime novel in order to preserve it.
Slice off the back and yeah.
Syracuse and Villanova have both destroyed a novel for the cause because they're very fragile. I mean, these are more fragile than comic books print. So you can't open a 150-year-old dime novel even to digitize it without destroying the binding.
Some of them were working with photocopies, and you can tell from the photocopy from the ragged edges of the paper that it's crumbled off. So but they're not going to last much longer without a reprint like this.
Right. So there was a period when Western themes and frontier themes was really popular. Dime novel books.
About 1660 to 1690.
I'm sorry, repeat that?
From about 1860 to 1890.
1690, the dime novel was almost entirely a Western genre. It really switched more towards detective, spy, intrigue, what we would call action.
And yet, even when it's set in the outdoors, and we've got horse chases and people hiding in caverns, and it still has a Western flavor, even when it's detective novels.
Interesting. What other themes, Western frontier themes, were popular outside of Mormons?
Oh, yeah, Mormons are just a fragment of what the dime novel. There were 60,000 of these. I've found 30 of them with Mormons in them. Americans are by far the most featured villains. There's also a pretty high percentage of novels about Chinese washers, and their name always seems to be Washi Washi. Like 10 of them. Ranchers. You're basically what would be resurrected in the 1910s as the Zane Grey Westerns. These are just more sophisticated hardcover, more expensive versions of the dime novel themes. Usually there's a woman who's captured by a Mormon or an Indian or somebody. And usually there's a hero who has to save the woman, and about half the times it's Buffalo Bill. He was kind of the alpha male of the dime novel. Dolores the Danite's daughter manages to get Buffalo Bill in. And this is because the author of 600 dime novels was Prentice Ingham, who was also the paid publicist for the Buffalo Bill Wild West show. Coordinated myth making.
Right. And they recycled a lot of stories, from what I understand.
They recycle a lot of stories. They use a lot of stereotypes in the original sense of that word. A stereotype originally was a plaster cast made of the printing plates that could be saved. It was the earliest hard drive available. And they just sometimes would bring the plates out, run them, and then just cut and paste in order to reassemble the story into something kind of new.
These stories, even though they're characters and they might take place in Salt Lake, they really are not Mormon. The stories could be about gypsies or Jews or, and so that makes it extra easy. You could, I think, recycle probably any novel in the dime novel series into a Mormon novel if you wanted to, just by substituting place names.
So, I mean, this could be a really silly question, but it seems to me, to sort of rehash what you said, that there are a lot of scripts that you could follow and just plug and play different people in. So is this sort of like a chick tract in that way? Like, were these ever used for religious purposes, or were these purely for entertainment?
As far as I know, they're just for entertainment. Well, there is that element in the Frank Marable ones that Mike has pointed out. Sermon of a sort in there. This stalwart young American lad who rides around the country on his bicycle, having adventures and solving crimes and that sort of thing, doesn't drink and doesn't smoke, and always manages to put a little speech in there to the other characters that you shouldn't smoke, and this is why. So in that sense, I suppose you could consider him a tract. But as a religious thing, it's not like the ones from the last 20 or 30 years.
Yeah. Do you have a sense, or do you know if any of these authors had real experience with the Mormons, or are they just pulling themselves from public perceptions?
In my view, probably none of them had ever met a Mormon to know, because the descriptions in their behavior and their language is like nothing that you.
So where does that come from? Where did they pull that? Your imagination, or was there already a public perception?
I need to go back and say the Russell, who did the Mormoness, did know Mormons. That's a different one. As far as these dime novel ones, though, whoever had the first. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's a remarkably internal consistency. They all describe Mormons the same way, and it probably goes back to Aiken. What's the first one?
Boudica?
I don't know. Aiken equals the White Avenger, which is 1870, and that's sort of the foundational text. The stereotypes, just an enormous way, because even though there were 6,000 or 60,000 of these novels, there were only about 100 people writing them all. Novels each, and they used each other as research. There's no sense that any of them had any idea beyond just the newspapers and the sensational press what Mormons were. But once they sort of established what Mormons were, that was remarkably consistent from 1870 all the way through to 1920, 1930. And it didn't change much because they did keep on script.
Let's go ahead and talk about some of those tropes.
You say the newspapers were a main source of information. I mean, where were they getting their information?
Some of it from the sort of sensational anti-polygamy books of the 50s, of the 1850s. You have news accounts of the Mountain Meadows Massacre that filter
you have books
in.
like some of those people who had actually lived in Utah and went back to write books, Mrs. Ferris and Mrs. Harris and some of the others, who wildly exaggerate and take sensational bits from. I spent a lot of time with the old newspapers, and I see not a lot of difference between the dime novels and a lot of what appears in the newspapers, except for length.
Some of that probably goes all the way back to John C. Bennett's expose. That's whole fantastical layers of your as a polygamous woman, you have different, tiers in the hair.
What you get out of dime novels and some of the other novels in this series, they do tend to be tied a little bit more to reality, in the sense that it's easy for me to pick out the conversations people are having that come straight from missionary tracts and missionary sermons. That doesn't occur in the dime novels. This is wholly fantasy.
But the John C. Bennett connection, that's a very good observation, because the very first novel that had Mormon characters in it was 10 years before the Mormonism. It was a British novel. It was Captain Frederick Marriott's Monsieur Violet. Plagiarized about 50 pages from Bennett's City of the Saints. Directly, didn't change anything. So Bennett's observations, especially about Danites, because that becomes one of the major tropes. They go directly into literature through Marriott, who was, actually one of the best-selling novelists of the 1840s on both sides of the Atlantic, and then that gets picked up by these dime novelists, and that's really what causes the resurrection of the Danite. And then it sort of hits a fever pitch when Bill Hickman publishes his memoir, Brigham's Destroying Angel. But by that time, he was even invoking the trope, the memoir, by a good 15 years.
So should we talk about some of those details of what the Mormon image was, what the tropes were?
Yeah.
Well, there's
always Danites.
Yeah, and normally the Danite who presents himself in the East is a well-dressed, well-groomed, well-spoken man who's concealing his dark insides. It's only when he gets back out in the West that, he's snidely whiplash and he twirls his mustache and you really realize exactly who he is. Then there's always there you go. Then there's always the fair young damsel who either beautiful and she's always pure and often she's rich. She's either kidnapped or hoodwinked into becoming a yes.
Are the Mormons ever the heroes?
Oh no. Never. So you might get a renegade Mormon who
rebels.
Right, and he helps the hero and then resolve it in the end. But there's always those two characters, and then the Danites. I mean, my favorite part of all these novels is the Danites live and work when they're at home in Utah. They've got all these subterranean passageways and caverns where doors open. Doors are actually rocks, and they swing if you touch them in the right place, and you can eavesdrop on what's happening way down the corridor, but sound apparently only travels one way. The people down the corridor never hear you.
Very convenient.
They get together in these pits, and they, with their weird costumes, and they hold trials. The stalwart young American who's trying to rescue the
Those of us
damsel.
who have worked for the church issue department, this is the employee cafeteria. The underground tunnel.
Yeah.
Anyway, sorry.
The underground tunnels have drips in some places. All that's missing is the flaming torches. but there's usually a trial involved with people in the Danites in hoods, like the ones that you see on the cover of this novel.
And then half the time they massacre a wagon train.
Yeah.
Oh,
That's a
as one does.
common thing.
That's a prime source of young women to kidnap for one reason.
Yeah.
There's one that we didn't anthologize. It's called California Joe's First Trail, and the hero, California Joe, is forced to become a Danite, and then they go try to find a wagon train to massacre so that they can steal the women, and they kill all the men, and then they sort of they like pick the women like you would pick a basketball team in middle school. Line them up and you pick yours like that.
So California Joe waits to save anybody till the men are dead?
He shoots to miss, and then he teams up with one of the women who's a real, good shot herself, and they escape.
But there was around the Reed Smoot trial period, there was a bit of a shift, at least in one of these novels. Can you talk about that, Michael, where they start recognizing that Mormons really, well, at least one author was fairly sympathetic in recognizing that that mainstream Mormonism was not necessarily involved in polygamy anymore.
One of them, Frank Merriwell, which is the Tip Top Weekly, which is really the squeaky clean serial aimed at boys. Frank makes a point of noticing that the rising generation of Mormons are monogamous and they can believe anything they want as long as they're good Americans, and it is an official splinter group. That is where all of the action happens. Now, you have all of the tropes in the splinter group. You have Danites and blood atonement, but Merriwell does recognize that Mormonism has changed. Now, at the same time, though, in the other most popular dime novel of the turn of the century is Secret Service, which is young King Brady and old King Brady, who aren't related. They just happen to both be named King Brady.
It's another stereotype. You couldn't come up with a second.
So they are brought in, and this is right at the time of the Smoot hearings. They're brought in by a senator whose daughter wants to marry a Mormon who's running for Congress, and they're brought in to investigate whether or not he's a polygamist. And that's where they uncover the caverns and the hooded Danites with lions, or the Lions of Judah, and all of the secret rites. And so you have a split there. One of them is sort of crediting Mormons with having adopted modernity. The other one is saying, on the surface, if you go to Salt Lake, it looks modern, but underneath there are all of these caverns. And they go back 2 years later, where they go back to the caverns, and there's still caverns. And so they're sort of not letting Mormons be modern. They're making the argument that it's only a surface change. There's another one, again, we didn't anthologize, called Old Cap Collier Among the Mormons. Here's one, again, post-manifesto, but the plot involves a Mormon apostle who's been kidnapping European women and bringing them and selling them to elders on the black market, at the same time plotting a coup against the United States to take over and form a theocratic polygamous society. Old Cap Collier, however, does manage to stop their nefarious plans. I just want to assure you that
That's a diverse
he's got it covered. Old Cap Collier was the master of disguise. He was the most popular detective until 1897, and then Secret Service came out with the Bradys, and they had color covers, and that totally destroyed Old Cap Collier.
Speaking of covers, so the cover on Dime Novel Mormon is, it's scintillating, right? That's how you pronounce that. Was there a direct tie-in between KKK imagery, you think, and presentation of Danites at this point? Because I know that the KKK kind of post-Civil War, kind of faded out a little bit and then came back in stronger than ever when we started getting a lot of immigration, into the States. The consciousness of equating Mormonism with...
I think it's broader than that. I think there's an earlier origin than the KKK. There was what was called the White Caps. And white cappery and white capping, all of these masked and hooded organizations descend from that. The Dime novel may have come directly from KKK, but there's an earlier ancestry that it could have come from as well. It's remarkably consistent, isn't it, Mike? Even when we
yeah,
the movie,
in the hood,
it's the same.
I've got about a dozen of these hooded Mormons, and the covers all look like the KKK. And the Dime novels aren't dealing too much with the KKK because they've got to sell Dime novels in the South where the KKK is pretty popular. So you don't have a lot of Dime novels. I've never encountered one that deals with the KKK directly, but they are definitely, I think, incorporating that iconography to portray Mormons.
So would you say that these tropes that were established in the Dime novels provided the source for later literature, like The Study in Scarlet and what's the other one? Purple Sage. And later.
Scarlet is not later literature. Study in Scarlet is written contemporary with the Dime novels, and it's clear. Well, Arthur Conan Doyle probably didn't read Dime novels, but Robert Louis Stevenson did. And Arthur Conan Doyle read Stevenson's The Dynamiter and pretty much lifted the whole story. But that's contemporaneous. That's 85 was the first serial publication of A Study in Scarlet. 87 was the book publication. So that's right in the heart of the Dime novel era. Riders of the Purple Sage, Zane Grey, is really all he's doing is resurrecting the Dime novel plots in a much more expensive kind of book. But yeah, the Dime novels feed directly into the Zane Grey Western and then into the pulp fiction of the 20s and 30s.
So do you think there was a significant change in tone, between the tropes of the Dime novels and more modern literature?
Sensitive antenna for anti-Mormonism. Somebody will leave a comment on my blog, and I don't know if I'm going to post that or not, kind of thing. Never twitched with these Dime novels. They are so fantastic in the fantasy sense that they're not offensive to me. And yet some of the other books later on are. So I that tells me, even though I haven't thought about trying to pin down exactly what the difference is in tone, there is something very different between Winifred Graham in the 19 teens from a little bit earlier.
The basic Dime novel stereotypes don't change until about 1990. If you look at mystery and Western novels of the 1980s, you get the same basic trope. The Danites wear suits. The polygamy happens a little bit under the covers, but those tropes are alive until the end of the 20th century, almost undiluted from the Dime novels.
Well,
it's different in some cases.
No wonder Romney lost.
That's actually
in '97 I wrote an article for Sunstone on the mystery novels of the 1980s. Blood atonement, polygamy, surfaces.
Yeah. One thing that I find fascinating, and maybe you can speak on a little bit, is the tropes that are being ascribed to Mormons basically come down to secrecy, sexual deviancy, and violence. Wouldn't you say that that's a trope that is commonly ascribed to any outsider group?
Absolutely.
I might add a fourth one, that they're enormously wealthy and their wealth is ill-gotten.
So we've seen that against Jews.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen that against Japanese.
Yep.
Right. I mean, is there an outsider group who hasn't had those specific parameters applied to them at some point?
It's applied to blacks, some of the parameters anyway.
Well, are those groups addressed in dime novels in the same way that the Mormons are?
I have to defer to Michael
Michael.
that.
Chinese a lot, right?
There are a number of dime novels that deal in the South with African American secret societies. All of the Chinese laundry owners are in a secret society in the dime novels. The dime novel tends not to have anti-Catholic stereotypes, but the literature of just a few decades earlier, the 1840s and 1850s, has a lot of the same stereotypes with Catholics and with Mormons. As a matter of fact, one of the most famous anti-Mormon novels of the 50s was Orville Belial's The Prophet. She was also the author of a novel called The Bishop, which was almost the same set of stereotypes applied to Catholicism. So yes, there is a reuse of these tropes and images with Catholics, Jews, Italians, Chinese. There are a lot fewer of these dime novels about Mormons than some of these other groups, and yeah, they're the same tropes: secrecy and violence.
Do we see any at racialization, like what Paul Reeve wrote about in Religion of a Different Color?
These are so cartoonish in my view that I don't.
Go ahead, Ardis.
Well, I don't see that because they're so cartoonish. There doesn't seem to be that's a little more sophisticated, I think,
than what these authors were.
But Mike may have picked up something that's gone right past me.
I think you can make the case, but I think Ardis is right. There's not a lot of sophistication. You realize that most of these novels were written in less than a week for 50,000 words. So we're spending a lot more time unweaving the baskets than anybody ever spent weaving them.
That's a great quote. Should we switch into how this might have influenced public perception? Like Ardis, you had discussed how this might influence missionaries out in the field. Can you get into that?
Taking the stereotypes as a whole, I mean, a book like this isn't going to teach you one thing about what Mormons really were, what they taught or believed. But you have to believe that it shaped the perception of people. So when a missionary is out trying to give a street meeting, or he's going farm to farm distributing tracts, you know these things are in the minds of everybody he meets. That has to have an effect, not only on the missionary himself, but his family at home. Some of these books are so insulting to Mormon women or to missionaries or who aren't meeting people out in the world. You know how you feel when you read an article in Time magazine or something that is a slur against your people. It had to have an effect on how people either saw themselves or the walls that they built between themselves and the outside world. It's a thing these days to talk about how Mormons feel falsely persecuted for this, that, and the other thing. It's hard for me to believe that Mormons, and for that feeling, when you read novels like this, when you're constantly being talked about in these terms, and when you go back east for business or on a tour of Europe, this is, as soon as anybody finds out you're from Utah, this is what they have in their minds. That would affect me.
Anything to add on that, Mike?
That's absolutely right. These portrayals are consistent internally, and they're consistent with all of the other popular culture of the time. you've got you have some people who are comic writing humorously about the Mormons, like Mark Twain and that other guy. Who do I mean, Ardis?
Stevenson, you mentioned the other day. I don't know who you've got in mind.
The guy who went to London and did the Artemis Ward. So they're making fun of some of these tropes and making Mormons seem more ridiculous than sinister. But the sinister, conspiratorial, secretive, sexually deviant Mormon is consistent. It's not that these portrayals were overwhelming in their number. The consistency of them is overwhelming, so that anytime people encountered Mormons in the newspaper, in magazines, in serials, in dime novels, they're encountering the same set of assumptions, and that explains what most people who thought about Mormons in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s, this is what they thought. There was almost no mechanism for them to think anything else.
Why would you even question it? For the most part, when it is as uniform as you have described.
And I would want to know. I don't imagine that these authors had an agenda.
Money. Got to sell a story.
So where do these tropes come from? I mean, they were published in the papers, but if for them to have such a sinister bent,
it sounds though to me like a writer, like Mormons would make the best villain, because if you're doing the Chinese, everybody can see he's Chinese. Clearly, he's sinister. We all know that. But the Mormons, from what Ardis was describing in Brian's Q&A before, are presented as initially this charming, sympathetic person. Everything is below, right? And even you said in the one novel, you have a beautiful Salt Lake with these caverns under it. And so
you just can't trust what you see when you look at it.
I mean, that's just dramatically compelling,
it's
right?
easy for the author to pick up on that, but where did that come from? Who's promoting that view of Mormons? Because
I don't think it takes a dedicated mind behind it. I think once it gets started, it just rolls.
Well, and the polygamy announcements several years after plural marriage starts, right? And so, I mean, there is some wonder whether Mormons are keeping secrets,
Yeah, I'm just.
They've talked about us.
Or how you have
they've talked about us that way, entirely independent of fiction. That's just what people believe about Mormons.
In where that.
So the question you're asking is really, how do tropes begin and then perpetuate?
Or how do these specific tropes?
Yeah.
Well, you have actual news of polygamy. You have actual news of Mountain Meadows filtering out. So those things tend to confirm the stereotypes. But the stereotypes preceded at least the Mountain Meadows massacre. But what you also have, you have stories that are calibrated to a very specific formula and really good for that formula. I mean, they're everything you need dramatically. You need a certain kind of villain. You need a certain kind of helpless heroine. You need a certain kind of hero. And the Mormon tropes provide the story that you need. And again, you're writing hundreds of these. You're writing 3 of them at a time. You're trying to make your living writing really awful fiction that's going to be sold to 10-year-olds. You don't think somebody's going to be reading it 150 years later. So it meets the needs of the plot in a pretty big way.
I would guess that these perceptions were promoted by people who had been associated with the Mormon Church that had a bad experience and were trying to perpetuate these negative stereotypes.
Maybe in the world at large.
Yeah.
I've got nothing to say.
By the time they filter down to these specific tropes, and these novelists picked up on them.
Well, like he mentioned Eberhau, and yeah, the earliest people did have unpleasant associations with Mormons.
So I'm
Well,
gonna throw one more question.
all of the best literature. This is Gerald Smith. All of the best literature of before this time, Count of Monte Cristo and before, always had black and white characters, unlike we have today, where we have heroes that are in the gray areas. And so I noticed as I read Eagle Plume that they described one of the chiefs of the Dakotas as the look of dignity and pride upon his thoroughly Indian face. One of the early tropes for Indians was the noble native. And that is just totally opposite of how they describe the Danites in that book, as all 7 of them looked like ruffians, except for the head Danite, who wore a nice suit and had blonde hair, whereas all the others had dark hair, etc.
But none of those ruffians were ever mixed with society. So
exactly. And so it made it very easy on these dime novels and to take that black and white, here's your good guys, here's your bad guys. There's no gray area in the middle. And so it's easy to sell this. We do this the same way today in like Star Wars, where you can tell who the good guys are and the bad guys are, from which side of the Force they draw their power from.
Yeah.
So,
Go ahead.
thanks. Well, I'm wondering, sorry, just to switch gears a little bit. I mean, what's the influence of the tropes, whether they're from the dime novels or elsewhere? I mean, I know there's inquiries into this idea that Mormon missionaries are trafficking in polygamous sex slaves and stuff. I mean,
that investigation in England by Churchill as Home Secretary is directly the result of a novel by Winifred Graham. Now, that built on the existing stereotypes, but that attempt to close down the church in England comes directly from a novel.
So why publish these now?
We're anti-Mormons and we're
Clearly not.
Well, one reason we're committing to publish these right now is that in 10 years, there won't be any of them. I mean, these are very hard to find. They're deteriorating. We had to make a lot of educated guesses because we didn't have the whole novel in some places. So
you're missing the last row of words along the column in many cases.
Or, the first, there's places that are cut off or places where the text is eaten out. So part of this is a preservation of things that we see as things that contributed to the Mormonism in the 19th century that are not going to be around unless we preserve them. So we're trying to do this for scholars of the future to be able to read these things.
And for me, it being able to enter the world of the past in some sense, the novel.
Somebody needs to turn down your volume because you're echoing back. Thank you.
My grandfather was a missionary in 1921 in England, and he actually was asked to show his horns. And he would lift up the corners of his hair and says we get them taken off at puberty. Those kinds of things come from these novels. They had a real effect in the real world, and they affected real people. And that's why I'm enjoying this so much. You can look at artifacts in the museum, you can dress up and pull a handcart, but that's not really entering, you're not really living the experience of somebody of the past. But when you're reading the words and seeing them form the same images in your mind as the people in England formed when they saw my grandfather, That's why I'm really enjoying it. You won't learn anything about Mormonism, but you certainly will learn about
public perception.
Yes.
I think that really informs modern public perception in the way
they didn't disappear. Just the calendar turned 1930 and now it's all over. No, they persist.
And there's a,
fun for me.
I mean, these novels informed Zane Grey's Westerns, which informed the pulp novels of the 30s and 40s, which informed the mystery novels of the 60s and 70s, which inform things that are being written today. There's a literary genealogy. And
it spread word to the screen. It's the same things in the movies.
Yeah.
Television, yeah.
Yeah.
There are things being written today that you can't understand without realizing that this is part of their genealogy of the perception of Mormons.
It'll be interesting to see how this plays out, because in the time when the Dime novels were popular, this was this tiny little window. It's the only view that most people had into Mormonism. But now you can't keep information from people. It's so available all over the place. And I'm sure that, people that don't have Mormons in their neighborhood probably know Mormons online. They probably have Mormon Facebook friends. You won't be able to perpetuate these tropes in this way any longer.
A lot of what I put on my Facebook page is a little clip from whatever historical document I happen to be reading that morning. I have one friend whom I've never met who's in New Jersey and is not a Mormon, knows next to nothing about Mormons, and so I'm fascinated at her response to a lot of these. A lot of what I put up are outrageous headlines or clips from the newspapers that could come right out of these Dime novels. And it's just fascinating to see her use the wow. This totally startling. I hadn't realized that anybody could talk about other human beings that way. She knows me, and she's seeing the contrast between what she would think of as me and what.
Right, and I think that that's really where perceptions change.
Yeah, this is not a missionary endeavor by any means,
right.
But it has an individual effect.
Yeah,
the other way.
The same that they did back then.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say we've got 1 billion Muslims in the world.
Right. That's a good.
And I mean,
that's a great point.
Hasn't saved them from.
No, but it might save that one person on the bus in Oklahoma City or something because someone has read the right thing.
And in a lot of ways, there's no functional difference between having access to 50 million web pages and having access to no web pages. When you have an enormous amount of information,
where do you start?
You still need to filter it through something. And, for a lot of people, these filters are still how they perceive Mormon.
Well, it seems like the intractability of the filter, whether it's, stuff people say about Muslims today or Mormons, is if built into that it is the idea of conspiracy and stuff that's hiding and, you're presenting one front, but there's this secret stuff beneath. It's awfully hard to counter, right? Because, Mountain Meadows did happen and we were polygamists and, so there's these little bits.
And you can point to all the good things, but that's really just a cover. You can't trust it.
Ardis, how do you feel that the death of Parley P. Pratt and the accusations of his one polygamous wife that had been married to a man in Arkansas, how do you feel that might have affected the perceptions of people towards Mormons stealing wives?
It was a well-publicized event. It is in the earliest days of the novels, so I'm not aware of any novel that grew directly out of that event, but it's one of the mosaic of events that people drew on to form their opinions of Mormonism. By the way, Eleanor was insane, but I can't speak directly to a single instance that that was affected by that specific event. But
we are substantially more likely to pay attention to news stories that confirm our biases than to ones that would force us to rethink our biases. Images of Mormons exist, and then you hear something like that about Parley P. Pratt, that just becomes another brick in that wall. And when you hear other things, you dismiss them because they don't fit. Human beings don't reason to conclusions. We form conclusions and then reason to justifications.
Exactly. People who convert either to the church or to a new political party are really kind of heroic and are mold breakers, because that doesn't happen that often.
Yeah.
So one thing that just popped out to me was that it seems like the only actual event that informed one of these books was also the most sympathetic, which was the Mormoness, and that was the Hansville massacre, right? And then it seems like all the rest of these more negative stereotypes and tropes are very generic, and except for
some references to Mountain Meadows, yeah,
and things like that. It seems like
yeah, we've got one character whose name is John Lee.
Yeah, John Lee, right? Yeah, that was Leigh, right? Any other final questions or thoughts before we wrap this up? Whenever you say that, that means nobody.
Sorry, it took me so long to log on.
I'm looking forward to some of the books that are to come soon that are more favorable present a more favorable image of Mormonism in literature.
Can you give us a hint?
Well, Mike hasn't talked about this particularly, but I'm really a fan of the book of Benna Hastings. It's written by a Mormon convert. Her character is a woman who is wanting to convert, but the thing that she has to battle to actually convert is the image of Mormonism that has been presented in her world. And so it really fits the series.
Story about the story.
Yeah. And the author is quite interesting too. So that's one I'm looking forward to. Mike's got practically every genre except maybe science fiction.
Yeah, I spent about most of last year reconciling the 1904 and the 1914 editions of Orson Whitney's Elias. That's coming soon, and it'll be a coordinated edition where it'll be the base will be the 1914 edition with a 1904 in the footnotes. Lots of apparatus than almost any project I've ever done before, but that's coming soon. And then we've got enough for about 3 volumes of the collected works of Josephine Spencer. That not just the senator from Utah, but we've been pulling from church magazines, and Ardis has found, I think, every word she's ever written.
She is a phenomenal storyteller. Some of it is routine and is stilted and so on, but there is some that is so forward-looking, especially in her treatment of women and the opportunities that are available to women, or that should be available. That should be a really good collection.
Cool.
So we're going to be migrating now to the Mormon response to this.
Can you repeat that, Mike?
We didn't hear that.
I said we're going to start migrating the series to the Mormon response to this literature. What were the Mormons writing?
Oh.
Yeah.
So how many volumes do you anticipate?
How many will Kofford publish?
Hundreds.
There are hundreds available, aren't there, Mike?
You keep reading.
We've got Ardis has transcribed enough to do 3 books a year for the next 10 years easily. And that exists already. We don't even have to go find things.
Cool.
Except that we'd like a balance between pro and anti and humor and mystery.
Yeah.
And there's a ghost story coming.
If you can find some science fiction, you've got a ready-made audience.
Forerunners of Battlestar.
Yeah.
Well,
There's actually an element of science fiction in a couple of Josephine Spencer stories.
yeah. The ghost story buttons in. Christine Haglund is editing that for the series. that was by one of the major Reconstructionists after the Civil War, who was actually the attorney that argued for Plessy, the African American, in the Plessy versus Ferguson decision. He wrote a ghost story about the Mormons. It's actually fairly positive. The Mormon character is a positive character. The Mormons aren't necessarily positive, but this character is positive.
And there's an unlimited supply of, they're not dime novels, but they have the same
lowbrow flavor.
There you go. There's an unlimited supply of those, believe me.
And then once copyrights start coming around, we've got some important stuff from the 20s. We're just waiting for the copyrights to expire on. Like Bernard.
I've already bought a couple of those books from Amazon. I'm ready.
Pardon me?
Said that I've already bought copies of some of those books via Amazon to have them ready when the copyright opens.
Yeah. So we're keeping a special eye on when copyrights expire because we've got a lot more to bring into print.
Well, I just wanted to thank you for joining us, and Mike, I'm sorry for the technological difficulties in getting you on, but I'm glad that it worked out. I think this was a great conversation. I hope that all of you have been able to take away some interesting things from this. What really intrigues me about this series is that it appeals both to literary criticism as well as to historicism. Right? You've got a real window into how pop culture influences public perception that affects people in the real world. So I love this series. I can't push it strongly enough. I hope that you guys will help us out by writing about it because we need more people to know.
This is a fun one to introduce people to the series too.
I think it also has a great appeal for readers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
They're fun books.
Yeah, there's some real plotting in this. We talk about stereotypes, but there are people who turn out to be not who we think they are, and there are pieces of jewelry that are dropped that turn out to be the ultimate clue. Right. There's some good plotting.
They're not just important, unimportant books. They're also just unimportant books. All right. Stop the broadcast. Thanks, Joe, for joining us.
I wanted to do this series is I can read stuff like this and call it work.
Exactly. Excellent. All right. Have a good night.
All right.
Thank you for listening to the Kofford Books AuthorCast. If you like what we do, then become a subscriber. It's free, and you can subscribe through iTunes, Google Play, or any podcast app of your choice. If you're not already a subscriber to our newsletter, sign up today and receive a free ebook copy of Mormonism at the Crossroads of Philosophy and Theology, Essays in Honor of David L. Paulson, edited by Jacob T. Baker. You can learn more about this promotion at gregkofford.com/pages/free-ebook. Also, follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/GKBooks for the most up-to-date information about our authors, releases, special promotions, and events.